Welcome back. We talked in the last lecture about the art and artifacts that have traditionally been associated with the Celts, and we saw that scholars are now no longer sure that this connection is completely accurate, or at least that it may be more complicated than we used to think. Today we're going to talk about another kind of information that scholars use to reconstruct the world of the Celts, namely language. The scholars who work on this field are called linguists or historical linguists, and historical linguistics is one of the most important fields of study for understanding the Celts, because languages preserve all kinds of essential information about the people who spoke them. But language must be used with extreme caution. Just as we are no longer sure that using a particular kind of artifact makes you a Celt, we can't be sure that people who spoke a certain language identified themselves in a particular way unless we have corroborating evidence that they did so. As I said in the first lecture in this course, scholars are now approaching the study of ancient peoples with a far more sophisticated sense of how human societies operate. Language does not tell the whole story of identity. But with that caution in mind, we need to embrace historical linguistics, because while language doesn't tell the whole story, it tells a large part of it. So today we'll talk a little bit about the origins of the Celtic languages, we'll talk about how the Celtic languages are related to each other, and we'll spend some time describing these languages and all of their weird and wonderful complexity. And we'll see that linguistic evidence really complicates the old picture of the Celts arising in Central Europe around Hallstatt and La Tène. That model argues that the Celtic languages arose in Central Europe thousands of years ago among the ancestors of the peoples who produced the princely artifacts at Hochdorf that we talked about earlier. The old model of a unified Celtic origin and Celtic identity really needs the Celtic languages to start out in the same place as the Celtic art and artifacts associated with the Celts, because otherwise you can't claim that one specific people is responsible for all the traits that we associate with being Celtic, including both language and material culture. So let's start by defining what we mean by Celtic languages. The Celtic languages are a branch of the Indo-European family of languages. The Indo-European languages include most of the languages spoken in Europe today, as well as many of the languages spoken in the Middle East and the Indian subcontinent. These languages all derive from a common ancestor many thousands of years ago. Scholars are not sure exactly when this language appeared or where, but the best estimate out there at the moment is that these languages developed somewhere in the Caucasus region of West Central Asia, perhaps around 6000 BC. By around 3500 BC, it's clear that branches of the Indo-European family had begun to diverge. Linguists have proposed various timelines for when the specific language branches of Indo-European appeared. They do this using a methodology that is quite similar to what genetic researchers do when they try to estimate how long it takes for certain mutations to work their way through a human population. The idea is that language change is analogous to genetic change. You start out with a source language, just the way you would with a specific gene, and then over time, as the language is spoken by different generations of people, and those people spread out from one another, the language will change, just the way genetic mutations spread out as people move around. Linguists can estimate how long it takes for languages to change in certain ways. Big changes, like in the structure of a language and its grammar, probably take longer than smaller changes, such as adopting new vocabulary. So linguists figure that at some point, maybe around 3000 BC, there's a lot of debate, a language broke off from the main Indo-European family that we can call Proto-Celtic or Early Celtic. That language, in its turn, would develop into the specific Celtic languages that we know today. The problem is that we're not exactly sure where Celtic fits on the family tree of Indo-European. What are its closest neighbors? What Indo-European languages is it most similar to? Now, why is it important to know the answer to this question? The reason is that if we know which languages Celtic is most similar to, we might be able to tell something about where Celtic developed, and then maybe we could test some of the ideas we have talked about already about who the Celts are and where they come from. The idea is that the languages that are most similar to each other probably developed right next door to each other. We can see this process taking place in historical time. Think about the Scandinavian countries, where the differences in language are small enough that the Swedes and the Norwegians can talk to each other without much difficulty. So if we find what language group Celtic is the most similar to, and we know where that language group comes from, maybe we can find out where Celtic comes from. It used to be thought that the Celtic languages were most similar to the Italic languages. These are the languages spoken in Italy. So Latin would be the most famous Italic language, though there are many others. This idea is called the Italo-Celtic hypothesis. We know that there are quite a few words in Gaulish that are similar to Latin. For example, the Gaulish word for ruler is riks. A lot of Gaulish leaders had riks as part of their name, like Vercingetorix, the chieftain who was defeated by Caesar. We will get to him in a future lecture. The word riks looks an awful lot like the Latin word rex, which means king. And rex is actually where we get our English word regal from. There are other similarities on the level of grammar as well, such as the way in which both languages form the future tense. I won't go into these similarities in any detail, but they add up to enough evidence to make the Italo-Celtic hypothesis worth considering, especially since these similarities seem to match up with what we know of the historical record of the relationship between speakers of Celtic and speakers of Italic. Because, in fact, as we've seen, there were Celtic-speaking peoples in northern Italy who did live right next to the Italic-speaking peoples of the rest of the Italian peninsula. They had moved down into northern Italy from Gaul in the middle of the first millennium BC, but they had obviously been very close neighbors even before that. So maybe we have a case here of people living right near each other whose languages had merely diverged increasingly over time. So if the Italo-Celtic hypothesis is correct, we would have confirmation of the traditional model we've talked about, where the Celts arise in Central Europe around the areas of Hallstatt, Austria, and La Tène, Switzerland, and then spread out to other parts of Europe. But there is a problem. The puzzling thing is, when you examine Celtic carefully, it turns out to be less similar to Italic than scholars originally thought. The similarities in vocabulary probably come from two different sources, neither of which argues for a close relationship between Celtic and Italic. First, you have words like rex and riks, which were originally thought to show this close relationship. But linguists have since pointed out that similar words can be found in a lot of other branches of Indo-European. So this isn't really a sign of a special relationship between Celtic and Italic. There are cognate words in Gothic, which is a Germanic language, and in Sanskrit, which is an Indian language. So here we have more of a case of a common origin for both the Celtic and the Italic word that goes way back into the Indo-European past. If we want to use the genetic analogy here, these languages are not first cousins, but fifth or sixth cousins. So on the one hand, the similarities date so far back that they don't tell us anything very specific about the relationship between Celtic and Italic. On the other hand, there are other vocabulary words that have probably been borrowed very recently from one language into the other. Too recently, in fact, for them to demonstrate that the languages are closely related on a fundamental level. These common words tell us not that the languages developed alongside each other, but rather that the languages merely came into contact at some point later on. The fact that English now has a word tsunami does not mean that English is closely related to Japanese. It just means that speakers of English and speakers of Japanese have come into contact with each other, and English speakers have decided that they like the word tsunami and want to start using it. And who doesn't think the word tsunami is great? It's actually quite interesting to look at what some of these words are that were borrowed from Celtic into Latin. And we have better evidence of the borrowing in that direction since there are so many more Latin texts that survive than Celtic ones. The kinds of words that were borrowed can tell us something about what the Romans found striking about the Celts. In many cases, the words they borrowed represented concepts or artifacts that were new to the Romans, that they just didn't have a word for themselves. One of my favorites is the word brachai, which was borrowed into Latin from Celtic. It means trousers or pants, and it is distantly related to our own word breeches. It turns out that the word has a distant Germanic origin, and so we get it in English directly from the Germanic family of languages, but the Celtic speakers themselves borrowed it from the Germans and transmitted it to the Romans. So you can certainly see that this word can't help us prove a close relationship between Italic and Celtic. But it can make another point, which is that for the Romans, observing the Celts of northern Italy, it was very noteworthy that they wore pants. In fact, many commentators on the Celts, both Greek and Roman, remarked on this. Pants were a striking novelty, and the Romans needed to borrow a new word to describe them. Other words that the Romans borrowed from Celtic tell us that the Romans were very struck by Celtic customs with regard to war and religion. The Romans borrowed a Celtic word for javelin, geisa, and another for chariot, esidum. They borrowed words for bard and druid. And note that we still use those words in English today. They also borrowed a word for beer, cervesia. Keep in mind, the Romans were wine drinkers. Beer was something of a novelty to them, just like pants. So just as the similarity between rex and rix dated too far back to prove a close connection between Celtic and Italic, the borrowing of words for trousers and beer is too recent to prove such a connection either. So the model of Celtic arising just north of Italy, along with the Hallstatt and Latin cultures, and then spreading outwards, isn't going to work. The linguistic evidence doesn't back it up. And this has implications for the traditional understanding of the origins of the Celts as a people. If the Celts are the people who spoke the ancestor of the Celtic languages, then the Celts probably didn't come from Central Europe, or at least the Celtic languages did not. Celtic speakers came into contact with Italic speakers, but the languages they spoke had diverged from each other probably thousands of years earlier, when Celtic speakers lived not in the northern part of the Italian peninsula, but elsewhere entirely. But where? A new model has arisen recently that tries to account for the rise of the Celtic languages in a totally different way. This is the so-called Celtic from the West model. The idea is that Celtic takes shape as a language group not in Central Europe, but on the western Atlantic coast of Europe. This theory is based on the fact that there are a lot of similarities in the material remains of the peoples who lived on the west coast of Europe, dating all the way back to the Bronze Age, including the great stone monuments known as megaliths that we see in western Spain and western France and in Britain and Ireland. The most famous of these is undoubtedly Stonehenge, but there are literally thousands of others. The assumption behind this theory, and it is an assumption, it cannot be proved, is that people who produce similar artifacts and trade with each other across a wide geographical area must have had a means to communicate with each other. Perhaps this means of communication was a Proto-Celtic language. The theory was proposed by a very famous British archaeologist named Colin Renfrew, who was honored for his achievements by being named Baron Renfrew of Camesthorne. And a lot of the people who like this theory are also archaeologists, note that, not linguists. Renfrew argues that the people who lived along the Atlantic coast of Europe were communicating with each other extensively by sea. In this period, travel could actually be faster and easier by sea than by land. That's why you see similar monuments and similar artifacts in this area, because the people were in close touch with each other, trading with each other, exchanging ideas. So Renfrew thinks that in the course of all of this trading, the people developed a kind of lingua franca, a common language that would help them do business with each other, and that common language was the ancestor of Celtic. This is how he accounts for the fact that you ultimately end up with Celtic languages spoken in Britain and Ireland, despite the fact that there is no evidence of the kind of Celtic invasion of the islands that people used to imagine. So according to this theory, Celtic arises on the western fringe of Europe, and only then spreads eastwards into Central Europe and down into northern Italy. This model is thus almost the opposite of the traditional view that the Latin people spread Celtic outwards from Central Europe. Instead of Celtic spreading westwards from Central Europe, it spreads eastward from Western Europe. There is some support for this Celtic from the West model, because it has become clearer and clearer in recent decades that Celtic languages were widely spoken in Spain, particularly in the south and west. We don't have written texts of these Celtic languages, as in manuscripts written on parchment or papyrus, but scholars have uncovered a lot of stone inscriptions, and they contain undeniably Celtic-looking texts. In fact, there is just as much Celtic evidence from Spain as there is from northern Italy. So these are two competing models for how Celtic developed: the old model that has Celtic spreading from east to west, and the new model that has Celtic spreading from west to east. The trouble is, the linguistic evidence doesn't support either model 100%. Historical linguists have done a very thorough analysis of Celtic in comparison with the other Indo-European languages, and the results are quite surprising. It turns out that Celtic shares similarities with some of the other branches of the Indo-European family, but they don't follow a neat geographical pattern. On a deep level involving grammar and sound patterns, Celtic turns out to be more closely related to the Slavic and Baltic languages, which are associated with Northern and Eastern Europe, rather than with languages we associate with Western Europe, like Italic and Germanic. In fact, Celtic has more in common with Indo-Iranian, that is, with the languages of the Middle East and the Indian subcontinent, than it does with Italic. So what are we to make of this? Were the ancestors of the Celts hanging out somewhere next door to speakers of Persian? Something happened in the remote linguistic past that we are not yet privy to. This is where it is possible, but only possible, that someday in the future, DNA may help us figure this out. Maybe it will turn out that the movements of peoples who spoke these various languages were much more complicated than we ever thought possible. This is all very intriguing, but scholars are still working out the details. All of those maps you see in books about the Celts with arrows on them, telling you the direction in which Celtic spread? Who knows? Stay tuned. So that's one question about the Celtic languages that we can't really answer, where they came from originally. Now I want to talk about another question that is also somewhat perplexing, which is how the various Celtic languages in the Celtic language family relate to each other. And again, we have an old model and a newer model to consider. The traditional way to think about the Celtic languages is to divide them into two main groups: continental Celtic languages and insular Celtic languages. That is, languages spoken on the continent of Europe and languages spoken in the British Isles and Ireland. The insular languages are then further broken down into two main groups called Goidelic and Brittonic. Goidelic refers to the Gaelic languages, which include Irish Gaelic and Scottish Gaelic and Manx, the language of the Isle of Man. Brittonic refers to the languages that were historically spoken on the island of Britain, that now include Welsh and Cornish, but also Breton, which is now spoken in Brittany by the descendants of immigrants from Britain who arrived in western France in the 5th century. The two main branches of Celtic are quite similar to each other, but there are also some key differences that make it easy to tell one branch apart from the other. The most obvious way in which they are different is in their handling of the P sound. All Celtic languages lost the P sound at some point in the remote Celtic past. The Goidelic languages mostly never regained the P, whereas the Brittonic languages got it back much later. Languages can do this kind of thing. So lots of Welsh words have a P in them, but very few Irish words do. There are, in fact, lots of cases in which the Welsh word will have a P, but the Irish word will instead have a K sound, spelled with a C. But just to make it extra confusing, we refer to this as Q Celtic, because the letter Q is actually supposed to represent a K plus a W, which, if you think about it, is exactly what Q does sound like. There are lots of examples of these equivalents between Welsh and Irish. The Irish word Mac, meaning son, as in Seamus Mac Donnell or Seamus son of Donnell, is exactly equivalent to the Welsh word map. You just swap out the C for a P, mac, map. This works at the beginning of words as well. The Irish word for head is cain. The Welsh word for head is pen. So we refer to these two main branches of Celtic as P Celtic and Q Celtic to capture this basic difference between the two parts of the living Celtic language family. Wait, you might say, what about St. Patrick, patron saint of Ireland? Well, St. Patrick was actually born in Britain, and his name comes from the Latin word patricius, which means patrician. So all the Patricks you encounter in Ireland today are starting their names with a sound that was foreign to their ancestors. So how do we account for this division? If we look at a map of the distribution of the Celtic languages, we see that the Q Celtic languages are spoken in Ireland, in northern Britain, and on the Isle of Man in the Irish Sea. The P Celtic languages are spoken in western Britain, southwestern Britain, and western France. We can account for the presence of Q Celtic in northern Britain because we know from the historical record that Irish settlers brought the Irish language to what is now Scotland. And we know that speakers of P Celtic took their language to Brittany. Otherwise, it's very clear that Q Celtic is an Irish phenomenon and P Celtic is a British phenomenon. That is, it is associated with the island of Britain. How do we explain this division? Scholars used to account for it by matching up the linguistic map with a traditional view of how the Celts had arrived in the British Isles and Ireland. As we have seen, it used to be thought that the Celts invaded Britain and Ireland in the centuries before Christ from Gaul and brought the whole Celtic toolkit with them, language, art, everything. But if so, how are we to account for the fact that Celtic comes in these two big varieties, P Celtic and Q Celtic? The ingenious solution that scholars came up with was to propose that there had been two different Celtic invasions, one by Q Celtic speakers and one by P Celtic speakers. Now, Q Celtic looks more archaic to linguists for various reasons, including the fact that it never gets its P back. So the idea was that you have an initial wave of invaders crossed from the continent into Britain and thence into Ireland, where they conquered the previous inhabitants and then settled down to speak their Q Celtic language. Several centuries later, a second wave of Celtic speakers, this time P Celtic speakers, invades the island of Britain but never makes it as far as Ireland. They simply conquer any Q Celtic speakers in Britain who haven't made it all the way to Ireland, plus any of the indigenous inhabitants of Britain who are left, and thus you have P Celtic prevailing in Britain while Q Celtic continues to be spoken in Ireland. It's a nice theory. The problem is, as we've seen, there's no evidence for it whatsoever. There doesn't seem to have been any invasion. The people in Britain and Ireland were probably speaking Celtic languages for hundreds, if not thousands of years before Christ. And we still aren't really sure how or why the Celtic languages got there. Maybe the theory of the languages arising in the context of trading is at least partially correct, and linguists are now dividing up both the extinct continental Celtic languages and the modern Celtic languages in new ways that are at least suggestive of a very fluid and interesting history that we can only get a glimpse of today. If you look at some of the new Spanish evidence for Celtic languages, it seems as if the Spanish Celtic languages may have been Q-Celtic, whereas Gaulish, the Celtic language spoken in what is now France, was P-Celtic. Maybe Celtic arrived in Ireland from Spain and in Britain from Gaul. That would at least be the simplest explanation for what we see. But all we can really say at this point is that the old model of Celtic spreading out of Hallstatt in Central Europe is probably wrong, and that the whole picture is much more complicated than we used to think. With that said, I want to spend the rest of this lecture talking about things we do know about Celtic languages, namely some of their most striking characteristics. I already mentioned one of the most noticeable, which is the loss of the Indo-European P sound, which Welsh later got back. Another one of these notable characteristics is the absence in Celtic of the verb to have. We might think of this verb as pretty indispensable. Possession is 9 points of the law, after all. How do you denote possession without the verb to have? Well, in Celtic, you use the verb to be plus a preposition. Things are literally at the person who possesses them. A quick example. If I want to say, I have a couple of words of Irish, which means I speak only a little bit of Irish, I say in Irish, Tá cúpla focal goil gagam. And this literally means, a few words of Irish are at me. So far, these features are interesting but not particularly scary. They would not deter the casual language learner by themselves. The most distinctive feature of the Celtic languages by far, and the one that causes shivers to run down the spine of language learners, is called initial mutation. What this means is that words in the Celtic languages can change their beginning sound based on the properties of the word that comes right before them. This means that words in Celtic languages are not the masters of their own fate. Let me illustrate again with a very simple example that I learned when I was in school in Ireland. Let's start with the Irish word for I understand, which is tigam. Irish, like Spanish or Italian, does not need to express the pronoun, so tigam is I understand. So far, so good. Now let's turn this into a question. Do you understand? Watch what happens to the verb tigam. In Irish, this is andigantu. Let's ignore the change in the ending of the verb. That's not going to bother anybody who has studied French or Spanish. But why does the word now start with a D? It turns out that you have to start the question with the word an, which signifies that a question is coming, and that word, that little word, by some magical linguistic property, turns the T sound of the following verb into a D. Though, to represent this on paper, we just put the D in front of the T to remind ourselves of what the word looked like to begin with. In linguistic terms, this is called the voicing of initial consonants, otherwise known as eclipsis. There are many other situations in Irish in which an initial T would get changed to a D. If that were not bad enough, let's answer the question, do you understand, in the negative. In Irish, that would be ní higgam. Now, the negative particle ní has the effect of turning the initial T in the verb into an H sound. This is called lenition, but here we represent the change on paper by inserting the H after the T. Just like with eclipsis, there are many different grammatical contexts in which you have to change the initial T sound to an H sound. So there are two different initial mutations you need to keep track of, and if you get them wrong, you are saying something totally different. Now imagine that you're trying to look up an Irish word you hear in an Irish dictionary. If you encounter it in one of its mutated forms, it's going to start with the wrong letter. You just have to know that an initial D sound after the particle un might really be disguising an initial T, because the dictionary is only going to list the word in its original unmutated form. Good luck. Celtic languages have many other grammatical peculiarities, but without a doubt, initial mutation is the one that causes the most headaches to speakers of English. So what light can the Celtic languages shed on the problem of Celtic origins and identity? So far, the picture is more complicated than we used to think, and thus more fascinating. Celtic may have arisen in Western Europe rather than in Central Europe, as scholars used to think, but it's also possible that Celtic underwent some mysterious developments in the remote past that brought Celtic speakers into contact with peoples in almost every corner of the Indo-European world. We know that the Celtic words were borrowed into Latin, and that tells us that the Celts and the Romans were very familiar with each other's culture. And we can guess that the divisions between the modern Celtic languages preserve some record of the different ways in which Celtic made its way to Britain and Ireland. Beyond that, of course, we have the languages themselves in all their glorious complexity. In future lectures, we will look at the literature of the Celtic languages in detail, because if we can be certain of anything about the Celts, it's the fact that language and literature were central to their society.